we continue our program, and we come to the essence of CONy, controversies in neurology. And traditionally, Professor Amos Korczyn, who is the founder of CONy, and who does not need any introduction, he's taking upon himself the first debate. So just to introduce the concept of the debate for the next 2 days, I'd like to explain how it goes. First of all, there is a chairman, this time it's me, and the chairman will introduce the topic and the hypothesis and the reason behind the topic, which is called the capsule. And then after introduction of the topics and the title of this debate, we will go for voting. We will vote either yes or no, pro or con, and you'll find it, as you'll see immediately down in your screen, there is a bar saying vote now, and you can choose either yes or no. The result of this voting will be shown on the screen, and all of us will see it. Then we'll introduce the two speakers, the two debaters. The first is yes, and the other is no. And in this time, it will be recorded, pre-recorded lectures. At the end of these two lectures, we'll have a rebuttal and discussion, and the audience will be able to pose the questions on the chat. The chairman will screen all the questions and will refer them to the speakers, and the open discussion and a live discussion will be conducted. I see that Professor Korczyn is here, and the opponent, Eider Arenaza, is also with us for tonight's debates. So it is a real pleasure to be here and to open the first debate of this program, of this CONy 2022 and mental health. Dr. Arenaza is the vice chair of the professional arena interest, the reserve, resilience, and protective factors. And also she is currently led several projects focusing on the effect of lifestyle and mental health variables on brain health in aging and Alzheimer's disease. Finally, her current work is identified resilience brain signature about combined Alzheimer's disease imaging and biomarkers. So this, and Dr. Arenaza will say yes, the cognitive reserve is a useful concept. On the other hand, she has a tough opponent with Professor Korczyn, who does not believe or does not think that this concept is a valuable one and a useful one, and he will say no. So in this stage, I hope that we're all tuned for the debate. And as you can see on the screen, the question is cognitive reserve useful concept? We start with the yes.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the Scientific Committee of Controversies in Neurology for the invitation to participate in this debate. I am going to argue that cognitive reserve is a useful concept. I have nothing to disclose. So I'll start with a brief scientific context. As many of you already know, the concept of reserve accounts for the disconnect between pathology and cognition. Already in the late 80s, there were some reports suggesting that a subgroup of older adults may harbor significant Alzheimer's disease pathology, but so preserve mental status, so normal cognition. Currently, we know that around 30% of cognitively normal people have an amyloid positive scan. These results are in line with the autopsy results, and both are supportive of the idea of resserve. In the 90s, there were several articles, as the one that I'm showing here, that started to develop and the concept of brain resserve. Here we can see three mechanisms that were referred to in the paper of Mortimer. First, a higher number of neurons and or the density of their connections, a better collection of cognitive strategies for solving problems, and also the remaining amount of functional brain tissue. So these are three mechanisms that were proposed to account for these disconnects between pathology and cognition. Currently, we are still trying to understand these mechanisms, and this is giving us also a sense of how influential this concept has been and is still being, as we are still trying to understand the mechanisms and working with this framework. Here, we can see a study by Shedela in Brain in 2010, where it was observed that cognitively normal people with an amyloid positive scan have preserved medial temporal lobe areas, what was suggesting that they have a higher number of neurons or a density of connections, as suggested by Mortimer several years before. So there may be many ways to assess the usefulness of a scientific concept, but I am going to focus on two. First, I'm going to argue that the cognitive resserve concept has brought important scientific progress and also has brought an accumulation of knowledge, and also that has provided researchers with a framework to test hypotheses and to understand inter-individual differences in aging and Alzheimer's disease. So here we can observe some numbers about the articles that have been published about cognitive resserve. So there are around 4,500 scientific articles starting from the late 80s. If we focus on last year, in 2021, there were more than 300 scientific publications about cognitive resserve, which once again, I think that is reflecting the importance and the usefulness of this concept still nowadays for the research community. If we look at the graph, we can see that there is an increasing amount of articles about cognitive resserve starting in 2002. It was in this year when Jacob Stern published the seminal work about cognitive resserve, where there was also developed the theory and the research applications of this concept. So there were several great points in this paper. One of them is that Jacob Stern is making a distinction between the passive and the active resserve. The passive resserve being the higher amount of neurons and connections, and the active resserve being cognitive resserve. So the ability of the brain to cope with pathology by using functional resources and cognitive strategies. Another great point of this paper, and I think is one of the reasons why this concept has been very useful, even if also may have some drawbacks, is that the indicators or the proxies of resserve, such as education, are very easily collected and are available in almost all the studies. And also in these and other papers published by Jacob Stern later, there were proposed many hypotheses that researchers could test about the mechanisms, the functional mechanisms underlying cognitive resserve as compensation, capacity, or flexibility. Finally, I would also like to point to the fact that even if cognitive resserve has been mostly used in the context of aging and AD, it has also gone beyond to other research areas. Here we can see in blue the number of papers about cognitive resserve in all research areas, and in orange the number of papers of cognitive reserve in aging and or in Alzheimer's disease. Finally, here I'm showing you some data of a survey that we did 2 years ago within the context of the Alzheimer's Association International Society to advance Alzheimer's research and treatment. We asked to the research community of working in the field of Alzheimer's disease, what was the theoretical model that they were using to work about inter-individual differences and the disconnect between pathology and cognition. And as you can see here, almost 85% are using the theoretical model or the framework of resserve, which once again is suggesting that this framework seems very useful for researchers. So this is about numbers, but what about the content? So I believe that the cognitive reserve concept has also provided researchers with testable hypotheses, and that has also helped us to advance our understanding on the inter-individual differences in aging and Alzheimer's disease. So you have probably seen this graph many times. This was published by Jacob Stern in 2009. And here we can see that in the continuous line is illustrating a person with high reserve, and with the discontinuous line, a person with low reserve. And as I was saying, we can see that the person with high reserve will start to decline later than one with a low reserve, but also at the moment that will start to decline, it will have accumulated more Alzheimer's disease neuropathology. So one stable hypothesis here is that we can observe in people with high reserve more pathology. Another testable hypothesis here is that the cognitive trajectories between a person with low reserve and high reserve may be different, because those with high reserve will start to decline later, but then faster, as is suggested in this graph. And finally, as I was saying before, there are also some hypotheses about the mechanisms underlying these effects that were described in several papers, such as compensation, flexibility, and capacity, that have also helped researchers to study the mechanisms underlying cognitive reserve. So one of the main findings and I think the usefulness of cognitive reserve has been to understand why some patients may be able to compensate for greater neurodegeneration. And indeed, there are several papers that are suggesting that patients with higher education, which is a proxy or an indicator of reserve, may harbor more advanced neurodegeneration. And here on purpose, I am showing you papers starting from the 90s to 2021, so that you can see how these concepts and these ideas are still tested. Basically, all these studies are showing that people with higher education, patients with higher education, they are showing more neurodegeneration as measured by metabolism or other techniques in temporoparietal regions. And here in the last one, we can see a similar result, but in frontotemporal dementia, so in frontotemporal regions. With the cognitive reserve concept, we have also understand that patients and people with mild cognitive impairments may be able to compensate for greater amyloid pathology, because there have been several studies suggesting that that people with higher education, patients, with higher education have higher amyloid pathology for a given level of cognition. And finally, speaking about mechanisms, we have also understood that there may be several mechanisms explaining why patients with higher education may be able to cope with more amyloid pathology or neurodegeneration. One of them is metabolic increases that may compensate for these increases of share with education, so in people with higher education. Another mechanism is the connectivity. In this case, there are a series of studies by Franz Meyer and colleagues, suggesting that left frontal connectivity may be one of these mechanisms underlying reserve. In this graph, we can see that that participants with low connectivity here in blue within that region are showing the expected association between memory and tau, while people with high participants, with high connectivity in that region are not showing the expected association between memory and tau. And finally, another mechanism that we are starting to understand in the framework of cognitive reserve is that the anterior cingulate may be involved in this resilience to pathology and to cognitive changes. And we are seeing that the structural preservation of this area may be important, as we can see here. People with more metabolism in this region are declining less than people with low or average metabolism in this region. And finally, Jacob Stern also found that this region was very important to sustain cognitive performance across different memory and other cognitive domain tasks. So basically, this framework has not only helped us to understand or to test that patients may harbor more neurodegeneration and amyloid, but also what are the mechanisms underlying this effect. Finally, within this framework, there are other hypotheses that have been able to be tested. For example, here we can see that in people with Alzheimer's disease dementia, those with high education, here in purple, are showing higher decline, as it is expected based on the cognitive reserve hypothesis. However, this has not always been found. As we can see here, there was no differential effect on the decline by group of low, average, or high reserve. So even if there is more controversy about the effect of cognitive reserve in cognitive decline and progression, still this framework is allowing researchers to test falsified hypotheses and also revised hypotheses. Then there is currently an important there are work groups, and there is there are updates and an important number of articles that are trying to revise and update the concept of reserve, also with other concepts that have been appearing during the year. So this is also showing how much this concept is useful and is also fostering scientific discussions. So to conclude, I will first say that there are also some drawbacks that I didn't comment, like the polysemy, the cognitive reserve concept as is sometimes used in many different ways. There is also a lack of consensus and common language, but there are work groups now, and there is also an important initiative led by Jacob Stern, where several researchers are trying to find consensus on definitions. The proxies of cognitive reserve in diverse populations, this is another important point, because education may not be the better proxy of research, the best, proxy of research in our populations. And also, as I was saying, there are new concepts in the framework of Alzheimer's disease that are appearing and that need to be also somehow taken into account in the framework of reserve. However, I will say that the cognitive reserve concept has fostered scientific research to understand the inter-individual difference in aging and Alzheimer's disease, and that the cognitive reserve concept is still fostering scientific discussions in the field, as I was saying, including work groups that are refining the theory, the framework, and also taking into account new concepts. So the concepts, I think the cognitive reserve concept has been and is very useful. Concepts in science are needed, but also they need to be revisited to keep up with scientific advances. So I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Arizana. I hope that the audience has listened carefully. And now we have the opponent, Professor Amos Korczyn, that will say no, a big no. And at the end, we'll have a discussion. So please stay with us. And Professor Korczyn, please say what you have to say about cognitive reserve. Is it useful concept? Please.
Hello, this is Amos Korczyn from Tel Aviv, Israel. I am the president of CONy, and traditionally I participate in the first debate. These pro-con debates are always on interesting issues, and it's actually a teaching exercise to show each other what are the problems that are still there that we have to solve. It's not a win-lose situation. Each side has its own strengths. And this time, of course, it will be very important. You already heard from Eider about his side, and I will soon tell you what is my part, not before I declare that I have no conflicts of interest. Now, my task is to convince you that cognitive reserve is not actually a useful concept. And you've heard the arguments for it, and they were very convincing to you perhaps, but not to me. And let me tell you why I think that cognitive reserve is not a useful concept, and I hope that this will be reflected by the vote after the meeting. So firstly, cognitive reserve is not really something that exists and that we can measure. Cognitive reserve is actually brain reserve. Every cognitive function is a function of the brain, and therefore to talk about cognitive reserve, we must understand what are the brain changes underlying the cognitive reserve. Are they such? Of course, we cannot measure them. So unless you are a dualist who believes in separation of mind from body, you must agree with me that the use of the term cognitive reserve just reflects our ignorance, and there is no such thing as cognitive reserve which is separate from brain reserve. So we only call it cognitive reserve because we do not fully understand brain function, and maybe we shall never be able to do it. So we use this term, cognitive reserve. How useful is it? Yeah, well, cognitive reserve refers to the fact that there is a discrepancy between cognitive function and the pathology that we see. So the neuropathologists tell us that this person who has cognitive impairment, this is due to amyloid or plaques or neurofibrillary tangles, or other changes, vascular changes, and so on. And it turns out that they are not accurate. So we know that the patient is demented, and they know that the patient has amyloid plaques or whatever, and they think, or they try to tell us that we are wrong, that we don't measure the right thing, or we cannot explain it correctly. But this is because they use certain markers of brain pathology, for example, brain pathologies. But who says that these are the right one? They use amyloid and neurofibrillary tangles, but maybe these are the wrong targets. The fact that these are not reflecting changes is demonstrated by the discrepancy between the pathology and cognition, as frequently seen in many studies who show that there can be many pathological changes that are not reflected by dementia. So there are many older people, my age and beyond, who are cognitively normal, and yet at autopsy will be shown to have a lot of amyloid deposition or neurofibrillary damage. But this is because the pathologists look at amyloid deposition and they say what is Alzheimer's disease. Had they looked at other targets, not amyloid and tau, for example, neuronal loss or maybe synaptic loss, then it would have been different. So in any case, for now, we see that there is a discrepancy between people's amyloid status and their cognition. So we've heard the previous talk that some people develop dementia at a later age because they have higher brain reserve or cognitive reserve or what have you. Is it a true statement or not? I think it's not a scientific statement in the first place. It's not an explanation. We say that some people develop dementia at a later stage because they have higher brain reserve, and then we say they have higher brain reserve, and that is why they develop dementia later. So this is, of course, a tautological, a circular reasoning, and it's not a scientific claim at all. As I mentioned before, cognitive reserve cannot be measured directly, and we use surrogate markers, and you heard before for mainly years of schooling. But year of schooling is inaccurate. I mean, when people go to school, the number of years of schooling reflects their cognition. No, some people have very high cognition in spite of having not too many years of in school, or doing or many types of teaching or in schooling, and so on. So years of education are very poor evidence of achievement, of scholastic achievement in the first place. And then there is the other point that it's not only Alzheimer's disease, it's not unique to Alzheimer's disease to have a wide spectrum of cognitive decline. There are many diseases that have a spectrum of onset age, including, of course, Alzheimer's disease, but not solely, as I will mention later. So AD is heterogeneous, not only in terms of age of onset, some people develop it early and others develop it later, but also in the clinical presentations, clinical course, imaging, and even genetics, as we shall mention later. So dementia appears in AD at different ages. So is this due to cognitive reserve? And there are many factors which affect the age of onset of dementia in Alzheimer's disease. For example, genetic factors like ApoE. So people who have ApoE2, epsilon 2 gene, then they develop the dementia much later. Maybe they will never develop dementia. Whereas people with carrying the ApoE epsilon 4 gene haplotype will develop it early. People who have cardiovascular risk factors will develop Alzheimer's disease early, and as well as those who have comorbidities. Now, in these cases, we don't talk about them being a reserve, cardiovascular risk factor lowering the reserve. They affect the brain pathology, and so does the ApoE status. So why do we need to talk about cognitive reserve? So what does cognitive reserve really tell us? If the conclusion is that with higher cognitive baseline due to higher education, you are somewhat protected, as we all are here in this room, this is a trivial conclusion. Of course, if we start with a higher baseline, it will take us longer until we reach a given endpoint. So this is a trivial, so it does not tell us anything. And then I have to mention also that cognitive reserve is a vague term. It is related only to onset age. Or does it relate to functioning before disease onset? Maybe those of us in this room who have higher education function better to start with and therefore it will take us longer to reach the threshold of being called demented. If this is so, then it is not really a reserve. We just say that some of us are better because we have higher education, and it's not necessarily the education itself, because there are these other factors that affect the age of onset of dementia, like the cardiovascular risk factors. And of course, we all know that we here in the audience with higher education status are also likely to have better health and, for example, better blood pressure control, which is known to affect dementia risk. So there is no study from the studies that you have heard in the previous talk, which shows cognitive reserve as an independent risk factor for dementia, independent from blood pressure control or all the other factors that we know affect the onset age of dementia. So, and again, as I mentioned before, having a range of onset age is not unique to Alzheimer's disease. It occurs in all late onset neurodegenerative diseases, in Parkinson, frontotemporal dementia, dementia with everybody, in ALS, etc. And there is no reason to assume that it is just the education which affects specifically Alzheimer's disease and does not affect the age of onset of ALS, for example. If the spread is the same in all of them, then we must look elsewhere than just having cognitive reserve. So take-home messages are the following. There is no such thing as cognitive reserve, only brain reserve. And cognitive reserve, as we call it, or as we define it, is a surrogate term to brain reserve, which we cannot measure yet. So we cannot measure cognitive reserve, we cannot measure brain reserve, and the existence is implied by its effects. And this is tautology, as mentioned before. The delayed onset of dementia can be explained by a higher cognitive baseline and by better control of risk factors. Cognitive reserve, is it a useful concept? I hope I could convince you that no, it is not. And I wish to end here and to remind you that beyond our meeting here, we are going to meet again, not virtually this time, but physically, exactly a year from now, actually March 23rd to 26th, and this will take place in Dubrovnik. Dubrovnik is a beautiful place. Dubrovnik is highly interesting, and we shall all enjoy meeting each other after so long a time in seclusion. Thank you for your attention.
Very much, Professor Korczyn. And as I said before, we have time for discussion. And I hope that with us, I think that Leah Greenberg is with us as well. Can you open your camera? And also Anthony Shapira, my co-chair of the meeting, is with us as well. So Anthony, please. Oh, if you can open your camera, I'd appreciate it. So shall we start the discussion? Is Leah first? Ladies first. So Leah, can you comment on what you have heard about the yes or no, whether cognitive reserve is a useful concept? Thank you again for your excellent lecture.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. I have to say that every time Professor Korczyn debate about anything, it makes it very difficult to say something the opposite. And Eider, I really enjoy your presentation, and thank you for bringing all this data. And of course, it was also very convincing. I have to say that, you know, Professor Korczyn really shocked me. I always work with the concept of cognitive reserve. And I agree that when we use this concept, it means that we don't know what we are talking about. We are not measuring. But on the other hand, this concept is also allowing us to start understanding better what we have to measure. And especially now that we understand that about 30% of the dementia has to do with environmental factors that could be prevented, this is where the cognitive reserve, or whatever term that we will use to represent this gap of knowledge of why some people will develop cognitive decline or not with the things we can measure, they make it very important. I hope that also now that we learn more about selective vulnerability, not only at the cell level, but at the systematic level, and ApoE is one of them, we'll be able to learn about it. And I just want to add one more thing, just to make things more complicated. There are some studies coming out in the past 2 years showing that almost everything we know about reserve and not being vulnerable, especially on the genetic level, changes according to ancestry. So for instance, for population of African ancestry, ApoE4 seems to be at least not harmful or even protective. And it has to do with how ApoE4 protect us from cardiovascular risk, but also risk related to nutrition. So I think we will continue having the discussion for many years, and it's very exciting in the field.
Thank you, Leah. Anthony, are you with us?
Yes, I am, Nat, but unfortunately, I don't have my camera with me.
So we will forgive you for that. And could you please, if you have anything to comment on this debate, please?
Well, of course, I will maintain an equilibrated position on this, naturally. I think both speakers gave excellent presentations, naturally. I think the issue of cerebral reserve is one clearly that has been attractive for many years, but quite what it means is a different matter, and undoubtedly it means different things to different people. I suspect that it also has a meaning outside of the neurological community that has more general applicability so people understand exactly what a specific non-progressive cerebral insult might do to the future of the patient and how that might be superimposed by subsequent progressive neurodegenerative events. So I think there is in practice sometimes a useful concept of a step change in cerebral reserve that may be followed later by completely different progressive pathology that results in the concept of cerebral reserve having been reduced. So I think it's the precision of it is not particularly useful, but the imprecise concept may have some practical value.
Yeah, I would agree. And if I may add, from my point of view as a stroke neurologist, we know that, first of all, that there is post-stroke cognitive decline, which is different than the degenerative diseases that we've been talking today. And we know also that even if for the same lesion, even strategic lesions in the hippocampus or the thalami or in the thalamus, or a different lacunar infarct in one person will cause cognitive decline post-stroke, which may also have to do with amyloidogenesis, etc. We know the concept of the mixed dementia. And so the other one, nothing happened. So who is going to be protected from this? Why one population of persons will be protected and the other one will develop cognitive decline? Is it the cognitive reserve or some cognitive connectivity, which is more rich in one person or population and the other not? I think that the definition is not, it's vague, but the I think that the concept, in my opinion at least, there's something there that we have to learn how to measure it and how to precisely define it. That's learning for, taking the example for vascular cognitive decline post-stroke. I think that's would be my addition to this concept, to this discussion. I just would like to see whether there is some question from the audience before we go to the rebuttal. So there is from Kennedy, they're saying that wonderful presentation here said, Professor Korczyn, do you think that the concept of cognitive reserve, by highlighting the limitation of our understanding of the pathological process, for example, that amyloid is only one part of the Alzheimer's disease? So that's a question for you, Professor Korczyn. Do you think that the concept of cognitive reserve has enhanced this research by highlighting the limitation of this pathological processes?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Natan, for this question, but I think it should not be referred to me, but rather to Leah, who's here. And she has published an important paper in Brain several years ago, showing that in her Brazilian brain bank, the cognitive decline correlates not with plaques or tangles, but rather with number of neurons. And this is what I have implied, that this is much more important, much more relevant. And had they looked at the number of synapses, the correlation could have been even better. Unfortunately, to look at synapses is not a simple thing, and to count them is it's easier for pathologists to look at just at plaques and count tangles. This is not the relevant thing. The relevant thing in Alzheimer's disease is not something that is added on like plaques and tangles, but something that disappears. The atrophy is important. The loss of neurons is important. The loss of synapses is important. And this is what you should look for. So the discrepancy between, and this is something that I think I mentioned during my talk, the fact that there is a discrepancy between cognition and the number of plaques or tangles only shows our ignorance or less of sophistication. This is not something that should surprise us. So the fact that some of us have a lot of plaques in old age and are not demented, I hope I think that this is something that we should talk about, and we should think about it, and we should look more seriously at the neuropathology of neurodegenerative diseases, as I think Leah has so wonderfully shown.
So, Leah, can you add something to this point?
Same line. Everything we measure neuropathologically, it's a correlation. Everything is cross-sectional. We try to do our best to make correlations and understand what are the factors that contribute more to cognitive reserve. So it's not that plaques and tangles are not important, but at the end of the day, just having them is not sufficient to create cognitive decline. We need to have loss of synapses and neurons, and not everybody has it. We know from community-based autopsy studies that there are a percentage of people that's not insignificant, that they pass away with cognition intact, but they have a lot of plaques and tangles and some other pathological changes also. So what makes these people preserve their neurons? This is what we don't know. And pathologists cannot really measure the neurons because, as opposed to protein inclusions in which the norm or baseline is 0, so everything there seems to be different than normal. We don't know how many neurons each one of us has when we are born. There is about 20% difference in the normal range for humans. So only when there is a lot of neuronal loss that we can appreciate it. So this is why we make these correlations with something else, and it's very imperfect.
So maybe we should look at what protects people from not getting dementia or Alzheimer's disease, than rather to find what is actually the causing or may be the causing or correlating with certain pathologies. There is also a comment from Dr. Samira Mamadova that she said that she agrees with Professor Amos Korczyn that cognitive reserve is unmeasurable. I don't see any other questions in the chat. So in this case, it's time for rebuttal. Arenaza.
Good afternoon.
What can you answer? Can you argue against what Professor Korczyn has said?
So I have to say that I agree with many of the arguments that Professor Korczyn made, but I would like to maybe clarify. I think I agree with the limitations of the concept, but I don't agree with the fact that it is not useful. So for example, just 2 examples about the dualism that he spoke at the beginning, right? Can we really separate brain structure and function? Probably not. But when we are doing research and working with brain imaging, and what we are often seeing is that people with, for example, higher education, they may have more atrophy, but this is coupled with higher brain function. So that is a mechanism that allows them to compensate. So there, the differentiation between brain reserve in terms of passive number of neurons, higher volumes, and cognitive reserve, which for me refers most to the function, that is useful. So in a pragmatic way, that differentiation, even if it's not realistic, let's say, as Professor Korczyn argued, I think that it is useful. Then I also agree with Professor Greenberg that what it is very important to understand the preservation of neurons and the preservation of brain structure and function. I agree also with Professor Korczyn that sometimes we call reserve, or we refer to reserve when we don't understand, when we maybe did not measure all the pathologies, and when we cannot understand all what is causing a cognitive decline. But I think that understanding protective factors that relate with brain structure and function across the life course, that's very relevant. And we know that before people start to accumulate pathologies, they have been exposed to many risk and protective factors throughout their life, and at that point, the way how preserved is the brain structure and function will make a difference. So a person with a more preserved brain function and structure, if they start to develop, for example, amyloid, to accumulate amyloid, they will be able to compensate for that. So again, I agree with Professor Korczyn's argument, but I also think that studying protective factors is important. And then finally, I also agree with him that the cognitive reserve concept maybe as somehow make the scientific community neglect other protective factors, because we have been focused a lot on education. And now I think that there are more and more studies trying to not only go above education and understand what are the proxies of cognitive reserve in other communities and also in minoritized groups, but also studying many other factors like exercise, cognitive activities, stress, etc. So in brief, I agree with the limitations, but I still think that the concept is useful. Thank you.
Thank you, Arenaza. And now, Professor Korczyn, it's time for you to rebuttal.
Okay, well, those who know me recognize that my hobby is not to sail, but rather to rock the boat. And I hope I succeeded in doing this to some degree. Now, what we agreed about is, firstly, that cognitive reserve is not measured, is not measurable, as Samira has just said, cannot be measured. So we only imply that it is there because we say, because later age of onset, for example. Why do they have later age of onset? Because they have higher cognitive reserve. So this is circularity. It's not a real scientific statement to say that because they have higher cognitive reserve, they develop the disease late. They develop the disease late for whatever other reason, and this must be biological. It's not cognitive reserve. It must be brain reserve. There must be something in the brain, maybe synapses, maybe something else, we don't know, but it's not, cognition, to say that cognition is separate from the brain means that you are a dualist, that you believe that the mind and the brain are not the same. But if you say that the mind is a product of the brain, then of course any change of the mind or of the cognition should be based on changes in brain substance. And we have not shown, we've not seen so far that a higher state of the brain is a defensive mechanism. So there are two issues that led to the concept of cognitive reserve. One is the dissociation between pathology and cognition, and we said already, and I think that everybody agrees that this is because we don't measure the right thing in the brain. So if we measure plaques and tangles, this is not important. What are important things are not these. So this discrepancy is not relevant to our discussion today. And then there is the issue of the later onset of the disease of cognitive reserve. So if you are on the top of a mountain and you want to reach the valley below, and it takes you whatever time it takes, then of course it's longer to reach the valley if you start up at the top than if you start in the middle of the slope. So this is trivial to say that you reach the bottom area because you have cognitive reserve. So this means that it's not a reserve, that you start from a higher baseline. None of the studies so far had looked at the baseline. Had they looked at the baseline, and this can only be done in prospective studies, not in retrospective. Prospectively, so if you measure our activity as normal people and we look and see when, if we're going to develop dementia, this is a prospective study that should be done and it has not been done so far. So the education years is a dirty measure. I mean, what does it mean? So we are all here in the audience, in the participants, have a higher education, of course. So we have a higher level. Does that protect us, or is it the fact that we have higher education level means that we protect ourselves better from maybe having high blood pressure or dyslipidemia or whatever? So we should not take the education number of years as a dirty thing, as an important thing. And none of the studies that have measured or have looked at the correlation between education years and time of developed dementia took into consideration also the confounding factors of metabolic changes and so on. So, and of course, educated people have better control of their life. And then there is the issue of the spectrum of disease onset. So of course, in Alzheimer's disease, not all patients develop the disease on the same age. But this is not something which is special to Alzheimer's disease. This is the same thing that happens also in ALS, so in Parkinson's disease. So what do we use in terms of cognitive reserve as reflected in patients in Parkinson's disease? Is it the same thing? Is it the same number of education years, or is it a number of, so it's not physical activity before the development of the disease that is thought to be this. So I think cognitive reserve has been coined as a term, and it has some values in it because we studied it, but we do not study it correctly. And in fact, to answer Jonathan, I think that it is not helping us. It is misleading us from the real question of why do some people develop the disease earlier and some later. These are the questions. And the fact that we have higher education is immaterial. It's a confounding factor, and we should not take this into consideration. So cognitive reserve is not a useful concept. It's a misleading concept. Natan, you're on mute.
Decided to unmute me. To mute me and while you were speaking, there were two comments. One from Dimitro Filimonov, and he mentioned a study published in Nature 2021. Actually, this is about the education. I think it was mentioned that a trajectory of individuals' brain network organization varies in relation to their educational attainment, and more broadly is unique indicators for individual brain health during older age. So that is this time entity, cognitive reserve, may be useful in clinical practice, but he agrees that is not cognitive reserve, should be called maybe brain reserve. And another comment by Lloyd Tran, and he said he thanks both speakers, and he asked you, Arenaza, is cognitive reserve related to neuroplasticity or neurogenesis? I agree with Professor Korczyn that cognitive reserve is a vague term, not measurable. Thus, it is difficult to define and cannot be characterized. The concept of cognitive reserve might be useful, but it would be misleading that might distract us from finding the main cause of Alzheimer. For example, amyloid beta is important, but it is not the main cause. So I thank both speakers. So these are the comments. And I think that we have already discussed these issues, unless you have to say something, Arenaza? Or
yes, maybe briefly. Thank you for the question. I totally think that the cognitive reserve has to do with neuroplasticity and neurodegeneration, but I believe that what I refer in my presentation about polysemy, I think that that's important because I think that I think about cognitive reserve in a different way. I really think about cognitive reserve in terms of brain function and how we use networks to perform cognitive tasks. And that's why I think it's useful, because it's telling me things about mechanisms and about how to cope with pathologies.
And for you again, Jonathan Kennedy, again, he asked you, do you think we have enough information about some of the more robust factors linked to cognitive reserve, such as education, IQ, socioeconomic status, etc.? That's his question. Should we aggressively address this at public health level?
I think so. I think that there is enough evidence, for example, for education. Education is one of the factors that is associated with cognition in later life. And of course, I think that this needs to be addressed at the societal level. That's very important, as well as other factors that Professor Korczyn was referring to, because education is not just about the years of schooling, but also about how highly educated people have also access to health later in life and to control of some of these factors. So I think that for sure is very important to address. As for the other question, if we have understood all the cognitive reserve factors, I do not think so, but I think that we are starting to understand that education and other proxies of cognitive reserve are related with connectivity, with higher connectivity, and with some mechanisms that may help people cope with pathology. And I think that's, for me, that's the important point, how we cope with pathologies.
I think that Professor Korczyn also has to comment on it.
Yeah, this reminds me of a debate that we had last year, or perhaps the year before, about this issue of amyloid and what should we do about it. And I said at the time that amyloid is the wrong target anyway, and trying to get rid of amyloid, we spent $25 billion on this during the past 20 years. Had we used this money to look at the known risk factors for dementia, like Alzheimer's, like high blood pressure, etc., then we would have done a lot better service to humanity than by wasting the money into this. So my conclusion last time is that Alzheimer's disease cannot be cured, but it can be prevented or at least delayed by looking at and addressing the risk factors that we all know about. So it's an epidemic. In epidemic, you ask the epidemiologist not just what the numbers are, but what are the risk factors. And we all know what are the risk factors, and we don't do enough trying to eliminate them. And this is the important thing to protect us against late age cognitive decline.
Thank you very much. With this happy note, we have to vote again. So the audience, now after you have yes and no, and you have we have a very lively and wonderful discussion. Let's vote again. Please vote. We have some quiet time, but please vote. For yes, it's 65. For no, it's 35. I can tell you that at the beginning, it was 94 for the yes and 6 for the no. And now it changed. We have 35 for the no and 65 for the yes. So still, the yes is the winner. But Professor Korczyn, you have changed a bit not a bit, quite a bit. Our at least thinking about the concept of cognitive reserve, and some of the audience agree with your arguments. So thank you very much. It was a very interesting and good fight, good debate, but there is no fight, as it just we raise the question and the hypothesis. We're still friends. We still see each other tomorrow. And tomorrow we have another debates in various topics in neurology. And we are all invited to join us tomorrow morning for a full day of very nice debates, even more kind of interesting than today. So good night or good morning, wherever you are, and we'll see you tomorrow. Thank you very much again for a very nice plenary session and first debate of CONy 2022. Bye now.
Thank you very much.